So welcome, thank you so much for joining us. This webinar is brought to you by the CEE Bill Alliance and Business Declares. We're here to learn about the CEE Bill, how this campaign can succeed in going further than the Climate Change Act, the Environmental Bill, the Fisheries Bill, and support regeneration of natural systems to give humanity the best and the most equitable chance of surviving and rebuilding in this climate and ecological crisis. We're going to be asking business leaders today why they're supporting the CEE Bill, what actions they're taking, and what they need from the government to help them to drive best practice in their sector. We're also really acknowledging that we're at the starting line of building a truly regenerative economy. I'd like to introduce the organisations that have been supporting the CEE Bill so far. And we can see here that there are civil society organisations, campaigning organisations and businesses, some of whom you'll hear from today. And it's a very wide alliance, and we're very much hoping that you will take the initiative and introduce the CEE Bill within your organisation to drive support for it from where you are. Thank you very much. So today we have the great pleasure of having amongst us Caroline Lucas and speakers John Elkington of Volans, Stephanie Biden of Bates Wells, Dale Vince of Ecotricity, Guy Singh-Watson from Riverford Organics, and Chris Davis from The Body Shop. Thank you so very much for joining us. I'm going to be co-convening together with Ben Tolhurst. So I'm Safia Minney. I'm a social entrepreneur and passionate about sustainable supply chains in the fashion industry and a long-term advocate for social justice and environmental justice. I created Real Sustainability, which is a platform to promote sustainable living and leadership last year. If we could move to the next slide. This compiles information on best practice on topics within sustainable living like activism, beauty, energy, fashion, home, money, technology, travel, etc. Next slide, please. And we also compile the latest initiatives towards transitioning to net zero in the climate emergency within business, leadership and finance, as well as running webinars. If we could move to the next slide, please. Ben Tolhurst will introduce Business Declares from this point. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Safia. It's fantastic to have so many people on the call today, as Safia has said. My name is Ben Tolhurst. I've spent my whole life in the corporate world. I've worked for a whole range of different corporates across a whole range of different market sectors. My day job is currently a UK board member for JLL, which is one of the world's largest commercial real estate organisations. I'm also a director for Business Declares, and I'll be working with Safia today as co-convener for this webinar. So great to see so many people, and it's at such a really important event. So can I extend my thanks for you for making time for us. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. So Business Declares, we are a not-for-profit organisation. We recognise that business has a major part to play in tackling the climate and ecological and societal crisis that we're in the midst of. And I guess really we exist to raise awareness of this agenda right across the business sector, and importantly, most importantly, accelerate action in tackling this issue. And we do this in a number of ways. We act as a convener of challenging dialogues, as we are doing today. We act as an agitator and I guess critical business friend, working with different organisations to explore edgy, difficult dilemmas. And we also, importantly, enable sharing of thought leadership, of good practice right across our member network. So I suppose ultimately what we want to do is drive the conditions through which it becomes mainstream that businesses fully grasp the urgency and the impact of the climate, ecological and societal crisis. And having grasped it, businesses then adopt new ways of working, new business models backed by transparent plans. So please do contact me or any member of the team afterwards. There will be details about joining Business Declares and becoming part of our network of businesses which stand together, learn and share together, and take action to make a positive contribution to the crisis that we're in. And just before I hand back to Safia, I would like to stress that one of the ways in which businesses can help tackle the current crisis is to support the CEE Bill. We so clearly need emission reduction, which surely has to be on a fair and equitable basis. We so clearly need to protect our ecosystems, reconnecting with our environment, with which our well-being and our survival is so inextricably interlinked. And we so clearly need a forum for decision-making and debate, which is cross-party. This is not a political issue. This is an existential issue. And we are living through the most defining moment of our time. And we are the generation which has the privilege and responsibility of galvanizing momentum to address this. And we've all got a big part to play for sure. The business sector has a massive opportunity to be part of the solution. So I hope you find today informative. Let's get straight into the detail. Safia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. So the Climate, Ecological and Emergency Bill, what is it? Well, firstly, it's a joined-up approach to the climate and ecological emergency, focusing on urgency, science, targets, fairness and accountability. The bill emphasises the interconnected nature of the climate and the natural world. If we decarbonise the economy, but we don't stop destroying the natural world, we won't prevent the Earth's ecosystems from breaking down. In terms of the urgency in tasks, neither the government nor Parliament are acting with enough urgency. The bill enshrines into law the commitment to reduce emissions to net zero urgently, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement. The government's target of 2050 is just too late. The IPCC says we have to halve emissions by 2030 to have a chance of reaching net zero by 2050. That's only a 50-50 chance of 1.5 degrees. We need to shift to reduce to 7.6% year on year until 2030. Next slide, please. Fairness. The government will be fully accountable for all domestic emissions, including aviation and shipping. The government and UK companies will be responsible for emissions resulting throughout our domestic and international supply chains, our entire carbon footprint. The bill stops unproven negative emissions technologies being used as an excuse to limit or delay cutting emissions from burning fossil fuels. The accountability behind the CEE Bill. The government will be fully accountable for the protection and restoration of UK nature with focus on biodiversity, soils and natural carbon sinks. The government and UK companies will be responsible for stopping the damage caused to nature by domestic and international supply chains which deliver the goods that we consume, accounting for the UK's entire environmental as well as emissions footprint. Deliberative democracy. The bill makes provision for a representative citizens' assembly. Government, Parliament, scientists and citizens working together to create an emergency strategy to achieve the bill's objectives without undermining parliamentary sovereignty or our unwritten constitution. The CA will empower MPs to make bold decisions based on the best evidence and avoiding the polarising constraints of party politicking, while allowing people to have a real say in shaping the pathways to a fair and just transition to a zero carbon economy and a thriving natural world. So how are we going to be building the CEE Bill Alliance? Well, this will be built as an alliance through different sections of society, grassroots, NGOs, businesses, MPs and political leaders, councils, faith groups, and unions. There are regional alliance groups like the Bill Alliance. The Oxfordshire is a fantastic example. We're hoping that you'll be able to start regional alliances too, engaging MPs and political leaders locally and nationally, and winning the argument. Citizens' activism, authoritative science, and evidence of the bill's economic and social benefits. Here, I'd love to introduce Caroline Lucas. Caroline was the sponsor of the CEE Bill, introducing it in Parliament in September last year. She's also the UK's only Green MP in Westminster. Thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us. Please.
Thank you so much, Safia. Thank you for that really kind introduction, and a huge thank you to everyone for being here for this really important meeting today. I have to say that after the events of yesterday, it does feel perhaps that we are at the start of a slightly more hopeful period for our planet. Today's meeting couldn't be more timely. Just last week, NASA reported that last year was the hottest year on record, with wildfires raging not just in America and Australia, but in the Arctic too. According to WWF's most recent Living Planet report, over the past 50 years, population sizes of mammals, birds, fishes, amphibians and reptiles have fallen by a staggering 68%. In other words, every warning light on the dashboard is flashing red. Now, of course, you all know that the UK is due to host COP26 later this year, but it's worth remembering that even if all the pledges that were made at the last major conference of the parties in Paris 5 years ago, even if all of those were met, which is unlikely, we would still be on track globally for over 3 degrees of warming. That is double the threshold of 1.5 degrees that governments have agreed to aspire towards. And in the stark words of the United Nations Environment Programme, warming of 3 degrees would, and I quote, bring mass extinction and large parts of the planet would be uninhabitable. So here at home, the government is sadly way off track when it comes to meeting its own inadequate climate targets, in particular the 4th and 5th so-called carbon budgets. Greta Thunberg famously said, act like your house is on fire because it is. And I would say that pledging to reach net zero by 2050, as our government has, is the equivalent to dialing 999 and asking for the fire brigade to come in 30 years' time. We know that the fire brigade needs to come now, and that is what we intend with this bill. So in terms of what it does, Safia's already set out the parameters, but essentially, although the Climate Change Act was undoubtedly a historic piece of legislation when it was passed in 2008, and many other countries have followed its pioneering approach in terms of setting legally binding carbon budgets, nonetheless, it is now way out of date. It is not up to the escalating emergency that is at our door. And that's why this bill aligns our climate targets with what the science now requires. And as you've heard, at its core, the bill would place in law a commitment to doing our fair share of keeping global temperature rises to below 1.5 degrees. It patches the hole in the Climate Change Act when it comes to things like shipping and aviation emissions, which weren't covered at all by the current legislation, neither are consumption emissions. And it's vital that we don't outsource responsibility to emissions to other countries. We need to have those on our accounting sheets. And that's what this bill does too. It focuses on nature, on protecting and critically restoring nature and biodiversity. And it establishes a climate assembly to deliberate on the difficult decisions and trade-offs, which will be essential when we put forward this new emergency strategy. So the focus of today's meeting is on why businesses should support this bill. And one answer I'm very aware is that, there are going to be huge opportunities in the green economy, that's where the jobs will be in the future, that it makes good business sense to be ahead of the curve, that it's what your customers want, that this is where the investment is going to be going from pension funds and elsewhere. And all of that is very true. But I think a more relevant answer is this, that businesses should support this bill because your future All of our futures depend on it. There is no successful business on a dead planet. And actually, the good news is that many businesses are way ahead of government in their thinking on this issue. I was struck that 50 years ago, the New York Times published an essay by Milton Friedman titled, "The Social Purpose of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Well, a few months ago, the New York Times announced details of a new business network called Imperative 21 that's launched a campaign promoting a reset of our economic system. And as they say, and I quote, 50 years of shareholder primacy has left us facing a climate emergency, collapse in our natural system, unjust and unsustainable levels of inequality, and low trust across society. It is critical that leaders everywhere come together in a reset. We must make sure that we build back better with the many populations our current system has left behind. It will take radical collaboration between the private sector, public leaders, and citizens to create the economy that we need. So those are stirring words from business, and I couldn't agree more. And this new business network, Imperative 21, represents 70,000 companies, 20 million employees, $6.6 trillion in revenue, and $15 trillion in assets under management. Some companies are already doing business in this way. And to separate the honest from the greenwash, and let's face it, that's something that needs to be done, then B Corp certification is auditing them by an objective not-for-profit to measure how good for the world they really are. So businesses have huge influence with governments. In many senses, they're already ahead of government. And increasingly, they are using your influence for good. And closer to home, we know that just last year, over 200 top UK businesses, organisations and investors called on our government to seek an environmentally focused recovery from the impact of COVID-19. And it made headlines across the media, making that case that a recovery plan to rebuild the economy must have an absolute focus on the climate and nature emergencies. And signatories to that letter included ASDA, the National Grid, PwC, Britvic, Lloyds, Siemens, BT, Coutts, Greggs, Heathrow Airport. I could maybe question about the alignment of Heathrow Airport with that, but nonetheless, there they were as signatures, and many others. And I think there is an increasing understanding that we are all in this together, and businesses has a vital role to play in ensuring that the policy framework that governments put in place creates the business certainty that you need and that investment needs. I just want to end by touching on the process and the status, if you like, of the bill, because I know people have asked about this. The bill is a private member's bill, and it is the case that unless the government makes time for the bill, then it doesn't get debated. But I just want to remind people that actually the Climate Change Act, the 2008 Act, which has been a pioneering piece of legislation that has not only influenced climate legislation in this country, but right across the world, that Act started its life as a private member's bill. And I have no doubt that when similar meetings would have been held in advance of that Act becoming law, people would have said, well, it's just a private member's bill. How does that affect things? But the truth is that a private member's bill can be a focus for mobilizing, for campaigning, for raising awareness and commitment, both outside Parliament and inside it. And it is significant that we have got support for this bill from MPs from all parties, that we've got nearly 100 MPs now supporting it, and these are very early days. And even if this bill in this form doesn't get parliamentary time next year, let's say, nonetheless, it sets the precedent. It is the blueprint, or the green print, if you like, that will be built on into the future. And so I have every certainty that by coming behind this bill, we make the policies in it 100 times more likely to happen. So thank you again for your interest so far, and I look forward to working with you to put even more energy and dynamism behind this bill to get it onto the statute book as fast as possible.
Caroline, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today, and I love three things I picked out of this: the way that you spelt out the imperative so insightfully and so directly, the way that you have signposted the role that businesses can play, and yes, I've felt for a long time that as a business person we have been ahead of government so many times, and you just want to drag them with you. And then thirdly, to make the point that we need to get behind and support this, because if we do, it can happen, and you've stated the precedents there from the past. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Can I just remind everybody to put any questions you've got for Caroline or anyone else into the chat, into the Q&A function. Sorry, the Q&A function, and we will come to those. Let me introduce our next speaker ahead of our panelists, and this is John Elkington. John, I would like to invite you in a second just to give your perspectives on what you've heard today, and indeed this topic generally. John is a long-term champion of sustainable business, and John has coordinated previously a letter to the Times from 20 plus CEOs in support of Exile back in April 2019, and John is also a non-exec Director of Business Declares. You can see on screen there a little bit more about him, but I will leave that for him to explain. So John, I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Ben, huge thanks, and hello everyone. Thank you to you, Ben, to Safia, to the organizers of this event, and it's a great pleasure to be part of it. I'd just like to say before I start to Caroline Lucas, thank you immensely for your efforts, your sustained activities over the years to keep the green flag flying. Sometimes it must have been fairly lonely, and yet you've been so catalytic, and I think many of us have seen you as a sort of a lighthouse, a beacon in all of this. So thank you very much. Let me just then talk about business a little. We are very inclined as movements to assume that business is a fairly consolidated entity, when, as we all suspect at the same time, it really isn't. And business at the moment, in its various different sort of forms, is going through an incredible series of simultaneous disruptions. So Brexit has been one of those in this country. COVID-19 is another, and the economic consequences and the social consequences of that will be felt over quite a considerable time. So again, business really being pressed in by pressures, which is sort of many of their scenarios and so on 18 months ago, 2 years ago, wouldn't have easily predicted. And then we've got a whole series of technology disruptions coming at us too. I mean, we can talk about the Internet of Things and autonomous vehicles and artificial intelligence and synthetic biology and so on. And if you're in a conventional business at the moment, some people are actually quite excited about what's coming at them, but the disruption that is in the pipeline over the next 10 to 15 years is vast. So I think when we talk of business, and particularly when we talk to business, we should keep in mind those sorts of pressures. Having said all of which, I think for the right sort of business leaders, this is one of the most exciting times ever. And when I say the right sort of business leaders, it's the people who are genuinely interested in promoting action, effective action, timely action on issues like climate change and the ecological emergency. There is no better time than when the old system is breaking apart in some ways, coming apart at the seams in many ways, to bring in new thinking, to bring in new priorities and bed them in. The initial stages are pretty frightening for all of us. And I think what we've just seen, hopefully, beginning to come to an end in the United States is just one symptom of these sorts of processes. We could think of some rather more local examples. We're at an extraordinary time too, when some of the biggest business and financial players in the world, you think of Larry Fink of BlackRock, for example, are starting to talk about, well, not only talk about this agenda, but they're actually starting to put pressure on their investee companies. And you've got people like Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, a huge and influential company, basically saying capitalism is broken. So the Financial Times a couple of years ago talking about capitalism, a time for a reset. So I think that consciousness is all around us, but we should be very careful about assuming that everyone is about to come in behind us, almost like the sort of the Pied Piper. Many of them are getting to the point where they are at least prepared to think about that. But I think we've got some stepping stones ahead of us before we really mobilize the bulk of the business community. And I think one of the things we've got to get their brains around, or help them get their brains around, is the fact that for many years NGOs, and I've been part of this in different ways, have encouraged business to stay out of politics. We don't want your voice, we don't want your lobbying activities, because we don't trust you, because we know that behind the scenes very often you're lobbying for things that cut completely against your public commitments. But now we're saying to business, we do want you involved, but we wanted you involved in a transparent way, and we want to see exactly what you're doing on these sort of big climatic and ecological issues. I think the bill is spectacularly timely. I think it's also incredibly important in all sorts of different ways. Whether it becomes an act, and I really hope it will, and Caroline, thank you for explaining that the previous act came out of a private member's bill. That's very helpful background. But I think it's incredibly important catalytically. I think and at the risk of repeating some of the things that have already been said, I think it's a signal of the sort of joined up thinking that we increasingly need in every sector of society. And I do believe business is often ahead, or at least certain components of the business community are often ahead of the government. But the government is absolutely critical. We need the political engagement. We need politicians to be very actively involved in this, and making clear longer term commitment. So it's joined up thinking. It uses the emergency language. And if you just think back a couple of years, nobody in business in their right minds would have talked about a climate emergency. And yet people are becoming comfortable with that. And I think that's a sort of invisible part of the impact of what Extinction Rebellion and all sorts of other actors in the system have been doing. As has already been mentioned, it's also crucial because it's coming through in the year of COP26. And thank God in some ways that COP26 was pushed back to November of this year. But by God, again, we have a challenge in actually making sure that that isn't simply one more gabfest where people sort of present their green credentials and then crawl away. We've got to hold global politicians, global business, global financial markets to account, but not just in a negative way, just to say, these are the things that we absolutely feel need to be done. This is your role in making some of that happen. And again, I think the bill is important, in fact, vital in that context. And then just to underscore just a final point, I think it's political, and more, I think we have to recognize that unless we get the politics of this sorted out, which is again why I thank Caroline right up front, this isn't going to happen. A business can do what it does, it can make commitments, it can embrace the sustainable development goals or whatever, but unless markets are reconfigured, unless resources are priced in a different way, unless particularly people who are doing the wrong thing are penalized and publicly penalized, we're going to have a lot of backsliding. One thing I just wanted to mention is we work with, at Volans, we work with quite a number of major leading companies in different parts of the world. And in the 1990s, something I noticed was CEOs, directors of major companies saying, my children are starting to lecture me at the breakfast table and saying, why have we got this product on the table, or whatever it is. I'm hearing that now at a very different scale. And just to pay credit to Greta Thunberg and the sort of the Fridays for Future movement and all the school strikers, they really have put this agenda on a quite personal way. And I've been working, for example, in Germany recently with a major company where two different directors told me quite separately their younger family members are now bringing intense pressure on them. I think that's critical. I think this is a cultural challenge, not just simply a sort of technical or even just a political set of challenges. Just towards a conclusion, business declares is not the CBI. I don't think we can ever hope to challenge the bigger battalions in this space, but what I think we can do is to continue to catalyze and interesting thinking. We can support some of the leaders who are already taking useful stances, and we can hopefully test the limits of the possible and push towards things that were previously seen to be impossible. And I think the bill actually helps the political classes in this country to move in that same direction. One final point. I do a lot of work with universities and business schools. We're working with quite a number in different parts of the world, Japan, United States, here in this country and elsewhere. One of the things I'm starting to see among younger people, and Safia right up at the front talked about recovery and regeneration, is a really interesting shift in the perception of younger people in these educational institutions with a future working in business and financial markets, in not just the sort of corporate social responsibility framing of all of this, but in terms of resilience and regeneration. And I think that's immensely exciting, because if we go from a degenerative business model to a regenerative one, that's a huge step forward. It's an immense challenge. And I think we've all got to recognize, going back to the Brexit and COVID and other elements of this, it's a huge challenge that we've got to get over. But early last year, January, we co-hosted a conference with Aviva investors. It was called the Tomorrow's Capitalism Forum. And the strapline was rather rude, perhaps, provocative, certainly: step up or get out of the way. And I think that's the message for all of us, whether in business, whether in politics, whether in civil society, or so on. Thanks for your attention. Very much looking forward to the discussion. Ben, if I may, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John. Really appreciate your insights there. And again, I think that three things particularly resonated with me. Firstly, timeliness. From a business perspective, that there is no better time, as you said, to bring in new thinking. The system is creaking, breaking, changing, and we are at a new beginning of a new order, I sense, and businesses can definitely benefit from that. The second point that you raised is around, we need governments on board. Businesses and indeed citizens can't just do this ourselves. We need the third piece of the picture, which is government. And then finally, as you alluded to, customers, colleagues, investors, they want this stuff to happen. They are demanding that of businesses. And even if we turn a blind eye to that, the other C, our children are demanding it of us. So to close with your piece, step up or get out, that is indeed something that our children no doubt will be saying to us. So I'd like to move on to introduce our fantastic panelists. I'm just going to do a quick intro and then invite them to come forward. So we have Stephanie Biden. Stephanie is a partner at Bates Wells law firm, and Stephanie works on the charity and social enterprise team. We have Dale Vince. Dale is the founder of Ecotricity Group, the chairman of Forest Green Rovers. Dale has pioneered green energy in the UK, in fact, with his first wind turbine in 1996. We've got Guy Singh-Watson. Guy is the founder of Riverford Organics. I'm sure you've all heard of them. He converted his farm to an organics production in the 1980s, and he now delivers organic food boxes to over 50,000 customers every week. And we have Chris Davis, International Director of CSR and Campaigns at The Body Shop. And Chris has worked alongside the Body Shop's founder, Anita Roddick, in helping make the company a world-leading ethical brand. So could I ask each of those panelists for a maximum of 5 minutes just to come forward and say a little bit about them, their organisation, and why this is important to them. Whilst they're doing that, please keep the questions coming, and then we will move straight into Q&A with Safia. So Stephanie, could I ask you to come forward first?
Thank you, Ben. It's really great to be able to join this panel today, and I'm really slightly in awe of some of my co-panelists. From Bates Wells' perspective, Bates Wells is a values-driven law firm, and we're the first UK law firm that achieves certification as a B Corp. We work with a diverse group of clients ranging from global household names and public bodies through to startups, and we're particularly known for our work with charities, social enterprises, and the impact economy. And as a firm, we've always been committed to having a positive impact through our work, and we have a long history of engaging in legislative and regulatory reform. So that includes helping the promotion of sustainable development become recognised as a purpose that's charitable in English law, and in creating the legal framework of what are now community interest companies. In 2019, we decided as a firm that we would formally recognise the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis, and we made a number of public commitments about how we were going to act in response. And these were firstly to decrease our carbon emissions and reach net zero carbon in those that we could measure in 2019, whilst working to identify more of our scope 3 emissions and then to reduce them on an ongoing basis. To take the crisis into account in developing the firm's strategy, to use the law as a means of addressing the crisis, to engage with all our people in decisions relating to our impact on the climate and biodiversity, and to encourage all our people to live in more environmentally friendly ways, to collaborate with others to amplify our impact, and to assess and report on our progress annually. And we've just published a report setting out what we achieved in 2020. So supporting the CEE Bill aligns with a number of these commitments that we had made, but I think particularly our commitment to use the law as a means for environmental change. We're committed to that, not just because it aligns with our expertise and our business as a law firm, but because we recognise the wide-ranging strategic impact that the law has, which can reach so much further than the individual decisions we may all make. And so we've been working on a number of initiatives around legal change. These include seeking to reform directors' duties in a way that would ensure that businesses are legally required to operate for the benefit of wider society and the environment, and seeking to clarify charity trustees' investment duties so that they're empowered to make decisions in relation to their investments, which properly take into account how climate heating and the biodiversity crisis will impact on their charity's mission in the long term, and to not be financing things that are contrary to that mission by having to make short-term decisions about financial gain. So we know that if you win one strategic case which sets a precedent, or you secure a change in some regulatory guidance, that can have a big impact. But what the CEE Bill would do is essentially give a formal legal basis and accountability to the actions which the UK as a whole needs to take if we're going to meet the aspirations that underpin the Paris Agreement. If you believe in using the law to achieve social environmental change, then primary legislation like this is kind of the ultimate level of legal change that we could seek. And I know that many people and businesses who are joining the conversation today will already have made their own commitments to take far-reaching actions to respond urgently to the climate and ecological emergency. But we need both individual and business actions at a wide scale. And ultimately, what's exciting about this bill is it would require us as a nation to make the kind of changes and commitments that are needed. And it creates the framework for collective conversations and decision-making about how we do that through a citizens' assembly. One of the next steps that we're looking at for Bates Wells over the next year is engaging more with our supply chain in our climate commitments and seeking to make sure that all our suppliers are aligning as much as possible and with the work that we're doing to face into the climate crisis. And one of the strengths, I think, of the CEE Bill is that it properly takes into account effectively the UK's whole supply chain. So the full greenhouse gas footprint from the emissions from the production and distribution of all the goods and services consumed in the UK, whether they're produced here or produced abroad and imported, as well as taking into account the impact of UK citizens' international travel. So it's effectively, again, as a nation, trying to look at the full impact of our supply chains. And then just on a personal note, one of the things I love about the bill is the way that it incorporates a citizens' assembly, and then it gives the recommendations that would come out of that assembly real clout. And I think that's a really exciting antidote to the divisions and the empty point scoring that are marking our current political environment. And it's so important when we know that we need to make difficult changes that will impact everyone living in the UK. And when our first past the post electoral system means that so many people don't feel they currently have a voice or have real representation in our political life. So on a personal note, I'm pleased to support the bill because of seeing the measures around that citizens' assembly. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I'm not going to comment after each of the panelists because I'm really keen to get to the questions, but though I could certainly make some comments and observations from there. Let's move straight into Dale. Dale, over to you.
Thank you, and hello everybody, pleasure to be here. We began life as a company in 1995, Ecotricity. We set ourselves up to fight what wasn't known then as the climate crisis, but to fight climate change as it was known. Having identified that energy was the biggest driver of greenhouse gases emissions in Britain, we set up to bring a new kind of energy to the market and actually to the world with world's first green energy company at that time. And we're a different kind of company in that respect because we are mission led. We're not here to make money. And I don't believe that businesses have to be here to make money. I think there's a different way to do it. When I look at the climate and ecological crisis, I think I see it more simply than most people, perhaps, in terms of the causes and how we fix it. It's driven by two things: fossil fuel consumption and animal consumption. And if we stop those two things, we solve all of the problems that we face. They manifest in the three areas of life, the three big areas of life: energy, transport, and food, how we power ourselves, how we travel, and what we eat. And we have the answers in all of those areas of life. We have renewable energy. We could get to 100% electricity on the grid in Britain in just 10 years' time. We have the smart grid tech to enable that as well. We can make our own gas here as well from grass. We have the scope, and in the process, obviously, we'll create a lot of jobs and economic activity and make a more resilient economy. Electrification of transport is already well underway with cars and buses. Planes will be in the air within 10 years, so that's entirely doable as well. And when it comes to food, we just need different choices, better choices. We need to stop factory farming, stop the incredible waste and devastation that it causes around the world, the habitat loss, the wildlife extinction, actually the knock on human health as well, directly from such a diet and indirectly through things like the coronavirus. When you put the three together, we don't just clean up the air, we don't just fight the climate crisis, we don't just create a stronger, more resilient economy and a happier place. We free up 75% of farmland if we go plant-based. That's 50% of our land mass, which we can give back to nature because we've destroyed our own rainforest already. And we can also use that land mass as a residual carbon sink for the parts of our carbon footprint that are very hard to reach with indigenous offsetting. And I think it's very straightforward. We need people, businesses and government to do that. And as I think John and other people have said, we need government more than anything else because people increasingly want this change. Businesses are seeing that and adapting their products and services as well. We need a government now that gets it because government have the big levers: taxes, subsidies and regulations. They set what we can do, what we can't do and what we must do. And they reward or penalize types of behavior. And at the moment, they reward bad behavior in terms of the climate and ecological crisis and make it harder to do the right thing. That would be very easy to change, shifting support from the old way of doing things to the new way. There are lots of examples of that. I won't dwell on them. Just to say that really, we have declared a climate crisis as a business. We've set 2025, we've adopted the XR target for that ourselves. We think we can get there in about 2 years' time. And I think there's nothing more important. We don't have until 2050, as other people have said. We've got to get on with it now, and we can. That's it. That's the end.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dale. Again, so many things I could react to there, but I'm very keen to get to our next two panelists. Guy, if we could move over to you next, please.
My parents started farming in 1951 at Riverford as Church of England tenants, and which is their wedding day. And that was a time of food rationing. It was all about producing more. They both wanted to do something useful with their lives, and to them that meant farming. And I would say over their lives, their farming life, my dad died 2 years ago, and my life at Riverford, I would say government policy towards farming has always been inadequate and normally about 30 years behind what was actually required. Today farming accounts for about 0.6% of GDP. It's pretty trivial in terms of economics, but it's arguably, depending what you measure and over what period, 20 to 50% of environmental damage. So I would just say it was just patently ridiculous to pretend that agriculture was a sort of market-based activity when it contributes so little economically and so much damage environmentally. I came back to the farm. I did actually briefly leave and go and work as a management consultant for my sins, but didn't like it very much. and came back to try and do something useful, like my dad, I suppose, in 1986 and started growing vegetables on a very small scale. Next slide. The business grew, pretty rapidly and has continued to grow over 35 years from just me and that wheelbarrow to a business with 1,000 employees, now co-owners. I'll come back to that. Delivering a veg box every 2 seconds, 100,000 a week we are on, and about 100 million turnover. So it's turned into a big business. But my views on business, ever since I decided I didn't want to be a management consultant, have, I suppose, become more scathing. I mean, Caroline referred to the purpose of business being really, through my lifetime, to drive shareholder value, and just how wasteful and damaging that has been in all sorts of ways. So this side shows that I started a cooperative of local growers to supply our veg box scheme in, I think that was in '97. So I've always been a fan of long-term cooperative relationships, and feel that they can be more productive, more efficient actually, than really expecting everything to be achieved through competition. Next slide, please. I can't remember what it is, but oh yes, this is foraging wild garlic in the woods on the farm. We actually pick about 20 tons of this stuff every year, and probably could sell a whole load more of it. And I think in many ways it represents, there's so much about it that we should be seeking to learn from. So the garlic actually produces a yield of fresh produce as high per square metre as most salad crops, but it's also contributing to wildlife, nature, sequestering carbon, providing visual amenity, but it's an incredibly complex and subtle system that requires a sort of management to maintain virtually that sort of covering of garlic on the floor, in an understanding of ecology which would just defeat most farming, and certainly farming ministers today. But I think there's so much to be learned from it in terms of its complexity, its reliance on perennial crops rather than annual crops, its lack of disturbance of the soil, and its embracing of the idea that we can sort of learn from nature rather than squash it and put something else in its place, which I would say had been agricultural policy for my and my father's life. Next one. Okay, so we buy from all over the world, Europe predominantly. This is actually a farm I own in France where we grow chilies. And we do also work a lot. We don't import from Uganda because we have a no air freight policy, but we do work with farmers there through the charity Send a Cow, and have done for 20 or 25 years. And I went there initially prompted by suggestions. Organic is all very well for you white middle class people, but it's not going to feed the world, is it? So I spent about 2 months in Uganda and have returned a couple of times to visit friends and growers there, and I can say categorically that an integrated diverse system of agriculture can feed the world. It could feed the world. I mean, Uganda could feed itself several times over. But and provide plenty of space for wildlife and sequester carbon. It's absolutely possible. As Dale said, we do have the solutions. We know what to do. It is really the reliance on market forces to provide all our solutions is the problem. It's not going to be the answer. I'm really doubtful that it can ever be the answer to such complex questions. Next slide. Riverford became employee owned 2.5 years ago. That's my dad sitting at the front, actually. He just about lived to see it. And I put this slide up because I do think, and I think Caroline referred to this, that I do think a more equitable distribution of income and in fairness and social justice is, I don't think you can have sustainable farming or sustainable business or sustainable anything without it. I just think it's fundamental, the concept that we do actually share this planet, with 7 billion going on 10 billion other people. If we can't, that concept of sharing and living together and not wishing to own everything yourself and believing rather more in cooperation and a bit less in competition, I think is absolutely fundamental to all policies to do with sustainability. I think is that my last slide? Next one, just in case. And these are the values that I suppose becoming employee owned, it was trying to move away from business driven by shareholder value to have a long-term approach. I believe that wherever, if you look at it in a long enough frame, always environmental sanity and economic sanity, they tend to sort of converge. So working together, looking at it in long way, being independent, so not necessarily following what other people do. Whatever you do, doing things well, incredibly important for any, you know, values-driven business. You still have to do stuff well. And I think that was my last slide. I think I'll probably, anyway, maybe there'll be some questions. I hope that was interesting. At least you got to see some fields.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I love those pictures, and as an allotment holder and an unlikely forager, I have deep empathy for what you've put up there, guys, so thank you. Moving on now to our last panelist, certainly not least, Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Guy. It was lovely to see fields. It was lovely to see a bit of summer as well. And down here in Brighton, it's not so summery today. It's a bit dark, so that lifted the spirits. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Christopher Davis. I work at the Body Shop. I'm responsible for sustainability and activism in the company. I imagine most of you are familiar with our business. We operate 3,000 stores when we're able to across 75 countries. We're a B Corporation, and we are part of the Natura and Co group of companies. And I guess the one thing to comment in terms of our planning at the moment, we have a sustainability strategy that is based on a future fit business benchmark, which is our intention is to become a regenerative business over the next 10 years. So of course, if you're not familiar with future fit, I would encourage you to have a look at that and learn, because it's a fantastic piece of work and a really good way to guide a business seeking to address some of the challenges that we've talked about today. Just a word on the bill. I mean, we at the Body Shop absolutely welcome it. It's holistic, as people have said. It's comprehensive. I love the fact it's systemic, looking at carbon, but also looking at ecology and seeing the system together. And I think that's exactly the way the world needs to look at the problems that we're facing. I think from a business perspective, business needs to move away from being less bad and focusing on incremental change to being good and targeting net zero. And I believe the bill will drive companies to be accountable to pursue those goals. I guess the curious question is, and it's a question we talked about in business declares as well, is should business encourage regulation? Because, you know, regulation is a pain, it's a burden of work, it brings additional costs, and indeed as part of this bill, the onus on corporations is to report impact of a company's actions and a company's supply chain. And our view of the Body Shop is yes, businesses should. Voluntary schemes, business declares, science-based target initiative, you know, some great work by people like the Carbon Trust is moving us in the right direction, but we need to accelerate faster, and we need to accelerate for all and by all. And I think this bill will require all companies to adopt practices which really need to be adopted if we are going to address the challenge that we're all facing. I think it's important to note, and maybe it's an interesting discussion point, that bringing the bill in for businesses is going to be a journey. It's not about creating instant change. It's not a transition to a new green economy just like that. It is a journey. I think for the Body Shop, we've started this journey, but we know it's going to take us some time. But the bill, I think, formalizes and accelerates the need for this journey to take place. And actually, Caroline noted that Caroline's not I am in Brighton, but unfortunately I'm on the other side of the boundary, so I've got some terrible MP, but she obviously, maybe I've often thought about moving just to live in her constituency. But anyway, Caroline mentioned there are business interests in moving this forward, and I think one thing that I've reflected on is this bill will really drive internal knowledge and internal understanding about a company's actions. With an internal understanding, with data, it drives better decisions, it drives efficiency, it drives better risk management. So I think in the long run, because this bill is forcing greater transparency and greater reporting, companies will see this as a sense of enlightened self-interest. So yeah, from the Body Shop's perspective, we welcome it. We think it's great that this is moving forward, and of course are proud to be a voice in this call for change and a call for action. So Ben, that's all I was going to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. Some great meaty topics in there, not least regulation and government. But I will like to firstly thank all the panelists and John for your amazing insights in this segment of the webinar. And let me hand straight to Safia, who's going to take us through our first section of Q&A.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, speakers. So we've had a large number of questions in the Q&A. I'd like to address two of them to Caroline right away, if I may. One of them is, how does the CEE Bill link to COP? And the second one, which I don't know whether you might want to be sharing as well with Stephanie, is how does the CEE Bill fit alongside the ecocide as a crime bill?
Thanks very much, Safia, and yeah, thank you for the presentations and some great questions. In terms of a link to COP, I mean, there isn't a formal link to it, but obviously having the summit in Glasgow gives us a real opportunity to use it as an opportunity to raise the profile of the bill, to get more support behind it, to hold meetings in the margins of the COP, the COP meeting. I mean, for it to be, you know, an essential part of the actual negotiations, then we would need governments already behind it, putting it on the table and so forth. And at this point, at least, we're not yet at that stage, sadly. But nonetheless, I think it is an opportunity both for us to put pressure on the UK government, saying, given that you are the host of this summit, you need to have some real climate ambition here, and net zero by 2050 is not ambition. But also it gives us that chance, I think, to really showcase it and to get more support actually from other countries too. I mean, just as the Climate Change Act back in 2008 was pioneering and set a trail for many other countries to adopt similar kinds of legislation, I would hope that, you know, through the different kind of parliamentary fora that will be taking place with parliamentarians from around the world, as well as all of the civil society meetings that will be happening in the margins along the same lines, we'll have an opportunity to really seed the idea of this kind of approach with many other colleagues around the world, and as a result have more pressure building on governments around the world. On the second question on ecocide, I mean, I'm a passionate supporter of there being a bill that would recognise the crime of ecocide and would pay massive tribute to Polly, whom we all miss hugely. I haven't thought through if there's actually a direct link. I mean, I think that if the measures in the bill were enacted, then we would be moving to a situation where ecocide would be far less likely and there would be sanction for it. But as far as I know, and maybe someone from the bill team might want to come in here, but to me they are parallel strategies rather than the same strategy.
I wonder if I could ask Charles Secret to come in on ecocide and also on what kind of timing might we be looking at, Charles? We've talked about how this has been a tried and tested way of bringing something very powerful. What kind of timeline are we looking at, and what can we as the business community do to help propel the CEE bill forward?
Wow, great. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, a tiered set of questions there. Well, the ecocide campaign, particularly focusing on the United Nations and passing United Nations resolutions and commitments to stop ecocide and to make that a crime against humanity as well as nature, is a very important complementary global campaign initiative that's going on. And you can almost see the bill and models of the bill in other countries as being the other side of the coin to the ecocide campaign, because we use the same evidence. You know, we pinpoint the nature of the same crisis and we push forward the same sorts of solutions. So there's great complementarity there. I think also that the question about COP26 and the climate change summit happening in November, of which the UK is a co-host with Italy. We also in May have another critical summit to do with the Biodiversity Convention, the so-called COP15 or Climate Conference of Parties 15. Both these global summits provide a wonderful opportunity for campaigners in this country and campaigners that we're already linking up with in other critical countries across the globe to push governments to not just make promises anymore, but to come forward with solutions and to implement those solutions. We get promise after promise after promise from politicians about what they're going to do, and then we find out that they don't actually do it. And this is where citizen action and business campaigning comes in, because politicians, particularly from conservative parties, but not exclusively, love listening to what business has to say. You know, the mantra of the marketplace has the solutions. Well, market forces can be important as long as they're shaped and bounded in the right way, which is why you need the right taxation, the right subsidies, the right regulations and standards. And businesses from all sectors, and we've heard from very powerful presentations from the panelists already, businesses from all sectors, both as individual companies, as business leaders, and through their trade and businesses associations, have an absolutely vital role to play in persuading politicians that the answers are there and politicians have to act, but also, as is happening, in adjusting their business models so that they continue to be successful from a commercial perspective in these new marketplaces. And all this stuff can be done. The only thing that's missing is political will, and that's where we're all in it together. So I hope that covered the three layers of your question.
Thank you, Charles. I think over to Ben now. We've heard about carbon taxation, really taxing fossil fuels as it comes out of the refinery, really enforcing standards so that we're beginning to have the externalities of nature and human rights costs properly priced into our so-called economy. And we've heard about how shareholder primacy needs to turn into mission primacy. But Ben, I'd like you to pick up some of those questions that the audience are asking and take the discussion further forward.
Yeah, I wonder if we could go to like a quick fire with each of our four panelists with a very simple question, which is this: what is your top ask of government with regard to this climate and ecological breakdown? If you had, what one thing you could get from them, one thing you could ask, what would it be? I'd really like to just get people's insight on that. Could I maybe start with Dale?
Happy to take that. My top ask would be end fossil fuels, set a date and drive it down to zero, the consumption of fossil fuels.
Fantastic, thank you. Maybe go to Stephanie.
I think it would be the same as my top ask in relation to the response to COVID, and that's stop acting like this is a publicity crisis and start acting like this is an existential crisis that affects all of us.
Well, thank you. Guy, over to you.
Well, if you just want one thing, I'm with Dale. I think it just has to be taxing fossil fuels, whether it's when they come out of the ground or out of the refinery or when you put them in your car. I don't mind where, but carbon. The carbon market so far has been a resounding flop and has wasted 20 years as far as I can see. Let's do something simple that we know will work. Just tax what we don't want people to do, burning fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you. And Chris, over to you. And John, I will come to you as well.
It's similar. I've spent some time understanding fossil fuel subsidies, and I still cannot fathom why they are still part of the international agenda. I don't get it, and I think, and in line with the other colleagues, I think fossil fuels phase that has to come, but fossil fuel subsidies, removing those rapidly, I think would accelerate the journey towards zero.
Okay, thank you. And John, do you have the same view, or do you have anything different there?
Yeah, I share all of those views. I think one of the parts of capitalism that we haven't much discussed today has been the financial markets. And much as I loathe Brexit, we're seeing financial markets around the world now scrambling to get into areas like social, environmental, green, sustainability bonds, and so on. So I think there's a major opportunity to engage the financial players, and they have very often a much bigger influence on business than even the policymakers and regulators. And one of the things I'm joyous about at the moment, we're working with, in the UK Parliament, with the all-party parliamentary group on fair business banking on a Bankers for Net Zero initiative. And I think we've got to engage the financial world in every way we can, not simply to get them to sort of parrot the commitments and all the rest of it, but as Stephanie said, to treat this as an existential crisis and to fund some of the SMEs and others who are really now going to have to deliver change at speed and at scale.
Well, thank you. So fossil fuels and finance, it is from that question. There's one more quick question before I hand back to Safia, which I'd like to direct to Caroline, if I may. Caroline, strategies for convincing our MPs to support this is the question. And from a personal perspective, I've singularly failed to galvanise my MP's support to support this, and I just get the standard response. Although I have come up with another idea which I'm taking forward. But are there any tips that you could give us as individuals, as employees, as business leaders, things that would actually get our local MPs to get on board with this? And I think there's about 90, maybe 91 so far. What can we do to up that, Caroline?
Well, it's a really good question. I think there are 93 so far, but that means that there's, can't do the maths quick enough. But anyway, more than 500 still to do. And I suppose my first message would be, don't give up. I mean, MPs are, past masters and mistresses at sending the fobbing off letter. So don't be fobbed off, keep coming back. If you're contacting them by email, do remember to put your postal address, because nothing concentrates MPs' minds more than remembering that the person contacting them is their constituent and therefore has a role in whether or not they get re-elected. Whereas in email, sometimes it's very easy not to remember to put your postal address, so they don't know if you're actually a constituent, and therefore they don't know whether you've got some more influence over their future. I would also say, once the restrictions are lifted and you can actually do face-to-face, then nothing beats having a face-to-face meeting with MPs. And again, it might be the case if you write and say, will you meet me about the Climate Change Act? They might well say no, or they would find some reason why they were so busy. So you might actually say, could you meet me about something completely different, like, I don't know, getting your bins emptied on time? Those are the sort of things that MPs quite like. So you could go along with that as your number one ask, and while you are there, make sure you ask them about the CEE Bill as well. But I think that maybe one of the most important things to do is to demonstrate that this isn't just you as one person asking this, to try to be active in whatever groups you are already active in your communities, whether that's school governors or whether it's the Women's Institute or whether it's a rowing club, whatever it is, that sense that the person actually eyeballing their MP is someone who represents a group of interests, and therefore not just one voice but many voices. I think that can make a difference too. I mean, it is true when it comes to the Conservatives in particular, who have yet to put their name on the line on the bill, that they will be worried about the economic impacts of it, because it challenges their economic ideology of thinking that it's possible to go on having infinite economic growth on a planet of finite resources. And many of those Tory MPs won't actually give you the kind of answer that you want until they know it's safe to do so from their front bench. But that's not an argument to keep pressing them, because the more you press them and the more they know that their colleagues are being pressed on the same issue, then those voices will be being fed up back to the party whips and ultimately to the front bench and the Prime Minister. And so I guess I would just simply say the fact that you're continually getting letters back that seem to be fobbing you off or not being interested doesn't mean that they're not having an impact. They will, and they do, and they stack up. And eventually you don't know which letter it's going to be or which contact is going to be that actually switches things. But things do go in that way. And I noticed Charles Secret in the chat was remembering how, practically all private members' bills that have ever become law will have gone through the process we're describing now, where people do get a bit downhearted and think, you know, well, if my MP isn't sympathetic, then do I need to go and do something else? And the answer is no, you need to do the same thing and more, and get more colleagues alongside you.
Fantastic, thanks. So great advice from Caroline there. I think that the bottom line there is don't give up. This, if there was anything worth fighting for, surely it's this. Safia, I'm going to hand back to you now. We depending on what you've got there, we've probably got time for one, possibly two more questions before you take us to close. So Safia, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thanks, Caroline, for your assertion of that need to be tenacious. Building really on John Elkington's point, and also Johnny Page who's asked the question, really for all the panelists, just very, very quickly, what in your specific sector, what do you feel that finance needs to pay attention to? What could make the difference in your sector? Can I start with Stephanie?
Sorry, Safia, I got distracted by one of the questions on the chat.
Oh,
forgive
me. Yes. So, what in terms of your sector, what would make the difference in terms of finance moving to support to support a more sustainable, a more climate action approach? Maybe it's a difficult one, perhaps for Bates Wells. Maybe I could come into Guy and put you on the spot for this one.
Well, my big problem with the finance industries and accountants generally is that they're only interested in what they can measure, and there's so many things in what we're talking about with the environment that are just really hard to measure. When we start talking about neonicotinoids and people start trying to assess the economic value of a bee in terms of its pollination, so it just makes me want to slit my wrists. Really, is that what we are as human beings? Nature has an intrinsic value. So, I suppose what I want from the finance industry is just a bit of humility to accept that they are a service. They are not the ones that determine, what it is to be human. They are just another service, like cleaning the loo and emptying the bins, that enables us to get on and do stuff. So humility would be what I was asking for, and a long-term view, I suppose.
Yes, and a bit of systems thinking. Thank you, Guy. Chris, can I come to you?
Sure. My answer is terribly dull compared to that, but maybe that's because I suppose I feel like I'm representing big corporations here as the Body Shop. The thing that's quite helpful to us at the moment is good financing, good interest rates around green bonds, and we're seeing an increased availability of financing on better terms from some of the larger institutions, because we are a B corporation, and because we're and because we have a strategy based on future fit. So I think that is getting those preferential terms, those preferential interest rates, and a commitment from a bank to invest to the point I think Guy made in the longer term is actually hugely helpful. It's not smashing the system. It's maybe Anita would have liked that and at the time. It's working within the system, but it is a marked transition where capital is going to better places than it was before. So I think I guess my response, Safia, would be more green bonds, and I hope by the green bond market moving, it might also drive businesses to embrace a philosophy of B Corps or future fit. And if they can prove their performance, then they can get a better business return. So that would be my response to the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I come back in?
Please, Stephanie.
Yeah. So I think a couple of areas that we're focusing on are around pensions and also around investments held by charities. So in pensions, one of the commitments we've made at Bates Wells is to engage all our people in living in more environmentally sustainable ways. And one of the things we did last year was to offer our employees a sustainable pension offering through our workplace pension scheme. But that's not yet the default offering. So we know that we need to do more to help people understand it and to get the buy-in, hopefully to make that the default rather than something they would need to switch to. but that's, you know, that's our employees. That's what, 230 people in London or something. And actually, if across business and across the legal sector, if you've got sort of magic circle law firms signing up and switching their pension schemes over to environmentally sustainable options, that would have a much bigger impact. And we know that there are some much bigger firms that are looking at these kind of considerations. And I was reading over the weekend that if you switch where your retirement savings are held, you can have 27 times as much effect in reducing your carbon footprint as if you personally stop eating meat and start using more public transport and reducing water use. I don't know who calculated that, but it's very significant. So another thing that we're looking at also is around the institutional wealth that's held by charities, and the way that charity trustees at the moment don't necessarily have the confidence to make decisions that fully take into account the environmental impact of the investments that they're making in the long term, because they feel like their duties as trustees might be constraining them to focus more on the shorter term financial returns that are then available for their charitable mission. And so we're seeking to clarify the law in a way which would empower and enable charity trustees to take these proper long-term decisions and to invest more sustainably. And again, between sort of charitable institutional investments and pensions, you've got a significant amount of institutional investment that could be shifted.
I think that's incredibly powerful. Thank you, Stephanie. Can I ask Dale to come in?
Yep. I like Guy's answer. That amused me, but I also like it. And actually, I don't particularly want anything from the finance industry, and I think that it tends to be the symptom rather than the cause of what's going on. You know, money goes where money can be made, and the problem starts with the market, which is set by government, controlled through taxes, subsidies, and regulations. And at the moment, we put an awful lot more money into subsidizing fossil fuels, for example, than we do renewable energy. If we change that, then more money can be made more easily in renewable energy, and less money can be made more difficultly in fossil fuels, and that will change behavior of everybody, including financial institutions. So I want nothing from the finance guys. Actually, I want the government to change the market.
Thank you. Thank you. John, very briefly, we've seen a huge movement in terms of the ESGs and finance. The financial sector has moved phenomenally in these last 18 months. Any last question or any last comment that you might have on what movement you'd like to see in finance to really support this building of a regenerative economy?
I just want to underscore what Dale just said, which is money goes where money can be made. And we know that money is nervous now. It can actually see all these different components of this change agenda coming up. And you know, if you're Charles Secret and you've been working 40 or 50 years on change, and it's been like rolling a rock up, you know, with Sisyphean task, it must at times feel it's not going to change. Now, however hard we push, the system's not going to give. Actually, one thing that keeps coming to mind, and I can't remember which of the Hemingway novels it was, somebody was asked, one of the characters was asked, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was gradually, then suddenly. And we now live in a gradually, then suddenly world where industry after industry, but particularly the financial industry, is going to find changing coming at it much harder, much faster than it imagined. And for people who take businesses money, I know Dale is saying that he perhaps is not minded to do so, but for those who are dependent on the financial markets, just remember, all they have to do is change an algorithm. They don't have to shut down factories and so on. So I think this decade will see evolution in the money world that are off the scale greater than perhaps, you know, the last 40 or 50 years might persuade us is likely or possible.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
I'm not sure I agree that money goes where money can be made. I mean, there are a lot of real morons managing our money. I mean, who invested in all those subprime bonds in the States, you know? I mean, you know, I would encourage people within the finance industry to seek out competent and honest people to invest their money in, and worry a little bit less about their algorithms, and they might make better decisions as a result.
Agreed.
Great. Yes, thank you, Guy. I've got a question, and I'd love each of you panelists to answer this one. So, what do you think about the membership and the remit of the PM's new Build Back Better Council? Are there members of Business Declares included? I don't know, Ben, maybe you'd like to answer that on behalf of Business Declares members. If it's suboptimal as it looks, how can politicians and business people work together to change this? So we don't have the PM declaring how important the climate is in one breath, but then appointing BP et al. As a type of body with the next. Would someone like to come in with a suggestion as to how we have something of real substance, something that can truly represent the integrity of the best business, as opposed to something that's... Can I ask, Guy, would you like to come in?
Well, I don't know whether Caroline's left us, but I mean, we've got government by focus group, haven't we? I think it's completely, it seems to me, it's virtually useless putting forward a reasoned argument. And what you have to do is make a story and get a lot of people behind it, which seems to be, to a large extent, your strategy behind the CEE bill. And I commend it. When enough people are interested, and as Caroline says, writing to the MPs, and there's enough storm on social media, then Boris will change his mind. I mean, let's not remember, I think it was 2 years ago that he told us that a windmill couldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding. The man is just responsive to whatever way the wind is blowing in terms of public opinion. So we just have to mobilise public opinion.
Thank you, Guy. Caroline?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a good opportunity for some shaming to go on here. I mean, it is quite ludicrous when you look at the makeup of that council in terms of people that really kind of get the agenda that we're talking about. So yes, let's try and shame them. Let's try and get to Carrie. That seems to be the answer. People say that Boris listens to the last person he spoke to, and that's, whoever was the last person has the most influence. And given that Carrie is probably going to be high up on the list of people that he is last speaking to, let's try and get to her. I mean, another thought, and I don't know whether it's worth the investment of time, but I have been struck by how Independent Sage has had quite a lot of influence and has been an increasingly trusted place to go to get information from experts around COVID. I wonder whether or not we need some kind of shadow group of businesses who would get together. I think that could be quite powerful if people had the time and energy to invest and have the shadow board doing what it should be doing and having much more powerful voices and really being a locus for the kind of conversations that we've been having. Because my sadness about today's meeting is that, relatively speaking, although it's great to have people with us today, relatively speaking, we're not making it clear that plenty of businesses think the way that we do, and we've just heard so many of them and why that's the case. And somehow we need to get that out there, which would challenge the idea that Bernard Looney speaks for everyone.
Thank you, Caroline. Well, we're closing up on time. I'd very much like to ask each speaker with us for one last comment. But at the same time, I'd really enjoy if the audience could type into the chat one action that they're going to be taking away from this webinar, how they're going to be introducing the concept of the CEE bill within their community or organisation. So if you could possibly type that into the chat, and if I could ask each of the speakers for a quick 30-second message. Can I start with Stephanie?
Thank you. Well, I think one thing that I'm going to take away is that it's really galvanised me to take the conversation about the CEE bill further within Bates Wells and raise more awareness of it. I think, we're doing so many things that actually some can sort of slip between the cracks, and this is one we could focus on some more.
Thank you, Stephanie. Who's next? John?
Well, I think 2020 was an extraordinary year, but 2021 needs to be, can be, and we should make it a milestone year. And COP26 is something we should aim towards. But I think the more we can work together and be coherent in our asks, the better. And so the very fact here that we have multiple organizations and networks beginning to work together, I think is very exciting. Let's keep on with that.
Thank you, John. Caroline?
I guess my message would be that the response to COVID has shown us that things that we've been told for years were overambitious and impossible and they couldn't possibly happen, actually can happen when the political will is there. I'm thinking of the fact that NHS debt was written off overnight, that the homeless were temporarily at least housed, that people's salaries were paid. It just demonstrates that when the moment is right, when there's enough political will, when the momentum is there, things that we think are unimaginable can happen. So I hope people hang on to that as a positive thought going forward. I really liked what was said just now about gradually, then suddenly. You know, some things always seem impossible until they happen. And just one last thing, I just want to pick up from the chat, because lots of people have been reminding me that part of my answer about MP lobbying should have been that if you really are finding a closed door with your MP, then going via councillors is a great idea. Councillors up and down the country are passing motions in support of the CEE Bill, and that's another way actually of getting to your MP too, if the local councils in their area are supporting this.
Thank you, Caroline. Chris?
I was thinking a similar thing to Caroline. I think my business has done in the last year would have taken us 5 changes possible. Transformation and revolutionary change is absolutely possible. We just need to believe it, and we need to put our energy behind it. So there is hope, but we all need to head in the right direction. I think if we can push this bill through, it gives us a massive platform on which to build.
I love it. Let's believe it. Dale?
Yeah, I agree with what Caroline says about the pandemic and what it's shown us, what's possible that for so long so many people have said would be too difficult. For example, the 330 billion that we've committed to it is 10 years of a zero carbon budget for our entire country. And that was, thought to be by many people too expensive. But my overarching point would be this, that the way our society works, the way our economies work, these are not laws of physics. They're not set in stone. They're not things we can't change. These are created by us. They're man-made, and absolutely we can change them. And we need to think about it in those terms. Let's just create something more fit for the purpose for the 21st century that we live in.
Thank you, Dale. Thanks so much. And Guy, last but not least.
Sorry, I forgot I was mute. Yeah, don't leave farming to market forces, please, please, please. We're a financial irrelevance, a huge polluter and destroyer of the planet. All the signs are from the agricultural bill that that's just what's going to happen. That and a combination of lobbying from the NFU and the agrochemical lobby and the food tech lobby. It really is looking everything. There's very little coming out. They've been sworn to silence, a lot of the people trying to sort out the detail. But what I do gather, it looks like it's going to be a bloody disaster. Don't let them get away with it. We're all citizens, whether with our food or the countryside or whatever. Do not let the NFU be the determinant of our agricultural policy. Lobby your MP. Let's make sure that the promises that were made, not to lower environmental standards, animal welfare standards, the promises to make sure that, imports would meet the same standards which have already been reneged on by the government. I mean, Jesus, we've had 3 weeks and they've already allowed neonicotinoids, started a whitewash paper on genetic editing, and managed to renege already on their promises that the imports would be the same standards as, it's looking really, really bad. They mustn't be allowed to get away with it. Write to your MP, lobby. Yep, that's my bit. Thanks.
Thank you. We won't forget the farmers with the CEE Bill, and we've got lots of lovely Riverford vegetables here to prove it. The pom-poms of the cheerleader of CEE Bill. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Thank you very much to excellent speakers and for the Business Declares team and also the CEE Alliance team that have helped put this event together. And we are delighted that the recording will be sent to you later on by email. And please use your leverage to really help us to build momentum for this incredibly important, absolutely life and death bill. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.